purpose of today's presentation, we won't be talking too much about specific software functionality or anything like that. I want to avoid making it an hour-long sales pitch. So the focus is primarily going to be on the elements of a successful implementation, be it Vault or really any other PDM system this would generally apply to. I'm specifically thinking more in the context of Autodesk Vault. That's what this presentation is designed around. So the focus will be on the elements of a successful implementation in that regard. From there, we'll move on to a description of how we at Hagerman typically implement Autodesk Vault, our process. It always ends up a little bit different for each customer. We do our best to tailor, specific activities based on need and budget. But I'll be laying out what our ideal, process would involve. We'll talk a little bit about the importance of professional assistance, a couple of, examples of situations we've encountered sort of cleaning up after self-implemented systems that, didn't go so well. And then we should have some time toward the end for some general Q&A about Vault. If any of you are planning to implement Vault or considering, say, upgrading from Vault Basic to one of the higher levels of Vault, we can address any questions about those that you might have at that time. So we're going to start out with the elements of an implementation the way I see them, again in the context of Autodesk Vault. These are pretty high level, essentially a lot of the tasks that you would have to perform, from the time you say we need to get our data under control to the point of having something implemented and in use and drawing benefit from. Right. So at a high level, the three big things, I kind of lump a lot into what I call the discovery and planning phase. Before you actually start executing anything and putting the system into use, you need to plan out how it works. Data migration is always a big part of any Vault implementation. And then, of course, training. Quality training, a lot of training, getting people comfortable with the system is going to be an important part of it. It actually gets used once you put it into place. So in my mind, the discovery and planning phase really is the most important part of any implementation, just because you need to get off on the right foot. You need to accurately capture what your needs are, pick a system, like the right level of system, define the scope, and so there's a lot of work that needs to go in up front to make sure that what you ultimately implement is something that you're going to get benefit from. And because of that, if there are problems at this step, it's going to often doom an implementation project. If you pick a system that doesn't meet your needs, if you maybe pick too broad a scope to start with, you can end up with a system that's too complex and too hard to use, and then ultimately just doesn't, fails to get off the ground. Now for simpler projects, maybe a little bit of discovery and then, some basic configuration will work with something like Vault Basic. For more complex implementations, there may be multiple rounds of discovery, planning, configuration, development, etc. So this typically would start with some level of initial discovery, and the goal there is to discover the use cases, what do we need out of a PDM system, who is going to use it, how are they going to use it, what needs do we have, and that will typically lead to some list of requirements. Now it could be as informal as a discussion, with like a reseller like Hagerman, say here's what we're looking for, can you help us out? It could be as formal as forming a committee and generating a document that lays out here are our needs. We've seen customers go through this a lot of different ways over the years. There are going to be lots of questions. And the end goal of this part of the process is to make sure you're picking the right PDM system, what level of Vault, Vault Basic, Vault, Workgroup, Vault Professional, but also what specific features should be implemented, right? Are we going to do bill of material management involved? Are we going to use the change order functionality? Just because something is in the software doesn't mean it necessarily needs to be put to use or put to use right away. Determining infrastructure is also a key part of this process. If you're a single site, do we have a server to put this on? Do we need to get any additional software, like SQL Server Standard Edition? If we've got multiple sites, do we need to replicate data? Can we get away with a remote connection? How many people we have using it and where? But then also, determine what it's going to take to get the system in place, be it, from a consultant, again, like Hagerman, or internally if you're planning to do the implementation internally. Do we have the right people with the right expertise, and how much of their time is this going to require to get done? Right. So the end goal of this initial discovery phase is to select a system, right? What level of Vault, or if it's another PDM system, come up with some initial scope of work. This would generally be pretty high level, but let's say this initial rollout, we're gonna implement it only for our inventor users. We're gonna go with Vault Professional. We're gonna do file-based lifecycle management. We're going to forego the job processor and rev block stuff, lay out in general what this, what this rollout's going to involve. Once you've determined the system and the implementation effort, then you can develop an ROI. What's it going to cost us in software, in services, in our own internal effort, and are we going to derive enough benefit from that investment of time and effort? And at Hagerman, we have some tools that we can help use to determine ROI that really factors in just about everything, including the benefits of getting professional help in implementing one of these things. There are real quantitative benefits from a productivity standpoint for doing that as well. Right, so at that point, you've selected a system, you eventually, buy some software. Now it's time to actually get down into the details of planning the implementation project itself. It's a project plan. I'm sure most of you have, dealt with a project plan of some sort in the past. It's a list of all the tasks that need to be executed, milestones, dates associated with those milestones, deliverables as well. What do we need to generate, maybe like from a document standpoint, out of this? And in the case of a PDM implementation like Vault, it's very important to get things done in the right order. Some tasks can be done in parallel. Some things have to happen before others. And we've kind of learned over the years what to do and when to do it, to maximize the benefit of everything. So in a Vault implementation project, common milestones would be, infrastructure prep, getting a server ready, maybe spinning up a new VM. In some cases we've had customers, when we do replication, one of the prerequisites is, improve the connection between these two sites so that we can actually execute something like replication. So that's always a very important step. Then, typically you get the software installed so that you can use that as a basis for training and testing for configuration. Training of administrators separate from end users. In a very small organization, there may not be a difference. If you've got 2 or 3 users, your admins are probably your users as well. In a larger group, you typically want to separate those so that you're not overwhelming the end users with a lot of administrative information that they don't need. Once the administrators are trained on how the system works and how to configure things, at that point it's usually best to go into developing the configuration of the system. Exactly how are all of the, what are going to be the button presses, what are the processes, what are the workflows. Trying to do that before administrators know how the system works commonly leads to a poor configuration. We've seen direct examples of that. I've got an example of that later on. Data migration is something that needs to be considered, commonly from the beginning. Part of the discovery process really needs to be, what files do we have, how many do we have, what's going to go in, et cetera. We'll talk more about that in a minute. End user training. So once you've got the system essentially about ready to go, that's when you get the users trained. You don't want to train the users a month before they get their hands on the software because they're just going to forget everything. And eventually you take it live. And then just some of the deliverables that generally result from an implementation project like this, the written project plan itself, so you've always got something to gauge your progress against. Documentation of the configuration of the system as well as the environment. Environment documentation is very important, meaning, what's the server, what user accounts are used for the services, are we using SQL Server Standard, what version? That becomes very helpful later on if you need support because, as part of our implementations, we strive to document that on behalf of our customers. But if you never need help from someone, it's really nice to have all of that consolidated in one spot written down so that there's no question about what needs to be done to solve a problem. And then, of course, often, procedural documents will come out of something like this. If you don't already have standard operating procedures for file management, this is a great opportunity to create those in the context of Vault so that when you onboard new people, they don't have to figure their way through the system. They can refer to a document that tells them how they're supposed to manage the files. Right, so from there, once you've got things planned out, the software install, I hesitate to say it just happens, but these days, installing the software is generally pretty straightforward. From there you move on to training of administrators and figuring out how the system's going to work. Now, most systems, Vault included, they can be used right out of the box. There are predefined workflows. There are even, in the case of, Vault Workgroup Professionals, some predefined numbering schemes, predefined categories. And those are designed around, either a manufacturing configuration, I believe there's an architectural configuration. If you're using something like Civil 3D, there's specific Civil 3D configurations and for plans. So, Autodesk has done a good job at coming up with a basic framework for most industries so that they could start using Vault straight away. That said, it's our experience that most organizations can benefit from at least a little bit of customized configuration, tweaking a workflow, adding a category. Security is another thing. Every organization is unique in terms of, who has access to what and how. So, security is something that can't be planned for in general. So that's also a consideration when you're doing configuration like this. At this phase, there's also typically going to be a bit more discovery required. Generally, at the beginning of the process, you're not going to necessarily ask all of the questions required to develop the configuration. Otherwise, you may never get the project off the ground. So the discovery that happens during configuration really needs to be made in context of the tool that you're using. So if you decide that we're not going to do bills of material with Vault, and so maybe Vault Workgroup is a good fit for us, there's no point in, discussing bills of material up front. You should do the discovery once you've got the tool so you know what's, what you have at your disposal from a tool set perspective. A question came in. I think I do want to address this because I'm talking about administrators right now. And the administrator training, this is a really good question. So the question is, in your experience, what is the job title of the person that is taking care of the admin side of Vault? Other than the end user, at what point would you recommend getting someone to take on the role of administrator as a full-time job? So Vault really, I consider there are two primary administrative duties with Vault. you might consider 3 of them. Autodesk Vault 2018, professional and workgroup introduced a couple of additional administrator roles. It's a very nice new feature where the admin roles are separated. The classical view is there are 2 types of administrators for Vault. There's someone that administers the back end, like the server. They're responsible for making sure that if something goes wrong with the server, like if the web services need restarted or if there's a support issue and logs need to be provided, they need to know where those things are. But then there's the front-end administration, which is, responsible for managing workflows, usually managing users if you're not using Active Directory with Vault Professional. Now, the backend admin in a larger organization, the backend admin is usually someone in IT. And they usually know almost nothing about Vault. They only know enough to get on the server and maybe get some log files and maybe push some buttons in the ADMS console. The front-end administrator is more workload. They're responsible for, if there needs to be a tweak to a workflow, they need to know how to do that. They typically need to be able to reset users' passwords if they forget. They need to be able to remove reservation on files that people have left checked out. That's probably most administrators on the front end, that's probably one of their more common tasks. But specifically the question of maybe a full-time administrator for Vault, in my experience, you would need a lot of users to consider a full-time admin. I'm talking dozens, if not hundreds, simply because with Vault, the idea is, I don't want to necessarily use the phrase set it and forget it, but it's kind of what it's like. I mean, the server is largely self-sufficient. We have some maintenance scripts for defrag and for backup. The server can run for quite a long time without any sort of intervention. There are some server-side tasks that are specific, that need to be run at specific times, but only in response to maybe changes to the way you use Vault, like a properties reindex. On the front end, once you get your workflow settled and you got your processes in place, from an administrator perspective, the 2 things they probably do most often is remove reservation and, help users get logged in by changing a password or something. Other tasks like keeping on top of are people checking their files in on a regular basis? Are people leaving too many files checked out? Are people checking in files too often? That's not necessarily the kind of thing that would have to be done full-time unless you end up, like I said, with hundreds of users. So, even with our customers that have, 50 or 60 users, I don't know that any of them necessarily has a full-time Vault administrator. Now, with that number of people, you may benefit from a full-time CAD administrator that also manages Vault, right? So if you end up with 50 or 60 people, there's probably going to be some benefit to having someone who is just, their whole job is knowing how to use the software as well as possible, knowing your workflows and your procedures as well as possible, devoting time to maybe continuous improvement on those processes. But if you're just talking about Vault, you need a lot of people before, there's really justification for a full-time admin. Right. So kind of getting back to the admin training, so I said there are kind of 2 halves. Generally, you can train the IT people, they can take some notes, and then they step away from the whole, implementation, other than needing to get logged into the server on occasion. Most of the configuration is ultimately going to generally be done by someone who knows the engineering documents, who knows the engineering processes, and is responsible for, making sure all of that stuff gets done right. So that's usually going to be an engineering manager, a power users, group leaders, like in a larger organization, people who are good with software and good with your processes, have been around for a while. But it's also important to document this stuff. This is a great opportunity, a PDM implementation, to generate procedural documents for your document management in general if you don't already have them. I can't count the number of companies that I've talked to where the way they do things is all institutional knowledge. It's not written down. Where things are is not written down, how they change and how they're used. Sometimes even how things are made isn't documented. So I am a huge proponent of procedures, both for making sure that all of the knowledge about how your system works isn't vested in one person that could win the lottery tomorrow, but also for onboarding new people, right? Especially if you've developed a very useful but maybe complex procedure for managing your data, it's vital that that stuff is documented so that when someone new comes in, they have a reference so that they're not just constantly asking questions for how to do things. Right. So in the configuration development, documentation is important. Testing is also very important. This is crucial if you're upgrading, say, from Vault Basic to Vault Workgroup or Pro. You are absolutely going to want to create a test vault, build out the configuration in that test vault, and make sure that it works the way you want. You don't want to be doing that kind of stuff on live data. Not that it would necessarily destroy your information, but you could cause yourself a lot of work. If you decide to go one direction, test it out and it doesn't really work. If you went that way with a bunch of your files, you may have a lot of work to kind of go to switch directions. So definitely test, iterate the design, and test again. And also don't forget that functionality can be phased in. Let's say you are going to go with Vault Pro and you want to implement bill of material management and change orders and the thin client, but you've never used PDM and no one in your environment has used PDM before. It's okay for the first few weeks or even couple months to start out with just check in, check out, managing the files themselves, then eventually move on to implementing the change order process and the bill of material. You know, avoid biting off more than you can chew at one time. So if we're kind of moving along the process of an implementation, you know, at this point, we've got some software installed, we've got what we think is a pretty good configuration in place, we've tested it out, and let's say we're starting from a brand new, we've never used Vault before, let's say, you need to consider your existing data, how it's going to get into the system. It happens on occasion when we talk with either companies that are just starting out or maybe they've been acquired and they're leaving behind a lot of, you know, old legacy data. But in the vast majority of cases, you've already got a bunch of files somewhere. And the question becomes, how do we get that stuff into Vault? You know, most of the time, we're working with customers who have just been using Windows folders to manage their files. Sometimes there's an existing PDM system, maybe something old, maybe something that doesn't really fit very well anymore. One thing we've had a lot of experience with lately is migrating customers from, you know, a PDM system like Blue Cello Meridian, which we're a vendor for them as well. And for a long time, that worked really well for our customers when they were only using AutoCAD. There are real benefits to using Vault if you're using Inventor. Vault is the best tool by far for managing Inventor data. And so several of our customers have made the transition from Meridian to Vault to make it easier to use and manage Inventor data. So there's that as well. And then, you know, other legacy systems or maybe a homegrown access database that's a drawing index, something like that. So those are generally the two starting points, Windows folders or an existing system. The first question should always be, what do we really need to migrate into the system? There's a tendency for most people to think, well, here's my S drive, all of my files are on my S drive, I have, you know, 200 gigabytes of files in the S drive. On day one, I want all those files in my Vault. That's almost never a good idea, especially if you're talking about parametric CAD data like Inventor, where If people have been using Windows folders for years to manage that data, there are going to be issues. It's inevitable. So you really need to consider what goes in, what's important, and you should strongly consider foregoing trying to shove everything in at once. If you're coming from an existing PDM system, that's a lot more realistic, right? You've got some sort of database that has kept track of where everything happens to be and maybe relationships, and we have tools that will help us transform that data from one system to another and keep all of your history. But the all of once thing is almost never effective if you're going, from Windows folders. The data is just, generally too dirty. But if it's a situation where, we have to have all of our data in, that could drastically increase the cost and complexity of the implementation. So we tend to actively discourage our customers from attempting something like that unless there's an absolute need for it. So some of the pitfalls when you're doing migration into a new PDM system, if you're coming from an old system, the new PDM system like Vault, it may not offer exactly the same functionality. So there's always, it's a huge benefit to have someone who knows how both work really well so that you can design the new system in as close a way as possible as the old system worked to get the same amount of benefit. But you need to know how the new system works so that you don't lose any information across that transition. The biggest pitfall that we've found over the years is the way people manage their inventor data when they use just Windows folders. And it's just the nature of the beast. It's just how it is. You typically end up with lots of duplicate file names. This is, I've been working on a machine and, I've been working on machines for 6 months and I've made, I don't know, 20 brackets over that 6 months and I'm not very, imaginative. So I've called every bracket I've ever made bracket or bracket 1 or bracket 2. So I may have across my whole data set, I may have 20 files called bracket and they're all physically different. And if you're very careful with your inventor data in Windows folders, it doesn't cause a problem. As soon as you start to move files around in Windows folders, that's going to cause a huge problem unless you're very carefully using project files. When you move to something like Vault, a best practice is to have a single project file with all of the data in one workspace. And when that happens with duplicate file names, you end up with a lot of issues of inventor asking you, okay, I found 10 files called bracket. Which one of these files do you want me to use when I open this assembly? So if you're using something like Vault from the get-go, you can tell Vault, I want all my file names to be unique. It won't let you check in duplicate file names, and so that's great. Windows folders, there's no such restriction. So that's a huge potential pitfall, and that's usually what takes the most time in a data migration side of one of these projects to clean up and to do is clean up that data and get it into Vault. And then potentially hard copy data. If you've got drawings sitting in a cabinet, it's not trivial to get that data scanned and put into a system. So, data migration can take a long time. It can take a lot of effort, but there are huge opportunities as a result, of this process. Most people know they have some long-standing issues with the way they organize their files, be it people making parts off of old drawings because they didn't know a newer one was present, the inability to track like revisions, especially for inventor documents where you can't just slap the rev number on the end of the file name like an AutoCAD file, but really identifying in your data set what's important. If you are like a sort of like a configure to order or engineer to order type organization where you've got some standard assemblies or you could standardize, but your data is not organized enough to make it easy to find things, this process lets you identify, standard assemblies, parts, drawings, and actually start to put those things to use. Reorganizing things, again, most companies I've worked with, especially if they've been using Inventor for a long time and have had multiple people sort of in charge of how things work, you end up with different regimes, and it's almost like looking through the layers of ancient civilizations, where you can see, okay, this was done in 2008 and it's probably organized like this, and then this guy came in 2010 and he started doing it this way. This lets you organize something in such a way and maybe document it so that when new people come on, this is the way it is. We put a lot of thought into it. If you're going to change it, you better have a really good reason. Otherwise, this is the way we're doing it. And then just some general best practices, when you're migrating data into a system, you're going to want to check your data set for what I call cleanliness, specifically Inventor file references, AutoCAD XREFs, etc. You're absolutely going to want to define a procedure for cleaning up the data. And this is something we do as part of our implementations, is we take a look at the information and we try to come up with a step-by-step process for how to take what is, broken data sitting in a network folder, get it cleaned up and organized so it can go into Vault the way you would like. That usually is, step 1, pack and go to the workspace. Step 2, reorganize, the files into the correct folder structure. Step 3, open up the Inventor assembly or drawings and make sure everything resolves. Check it into Vault, maybe do a rename to make things unique, and then repeat. Right. The most complex procedure I ever developed for a customer, I think there were 18 steps involved, but they had done some very interesting things with their data that required, some real work to get things like bills of material to update properly, etc. But it was an 18-step process that if you followed it step by step, you ended up with clean data that would go into Vault. So it's possible. Even in a worst case scenario, as long as the data is somewhere, you can usually get the job done. Now, if you're migrating from an existing PDM system, the best practice is to absolutely get some sort of professional assistance. Someone who knows the system you're coming from and the system you're going to, that has, tools at their disposal to automate the process, or can develop those tools if they don't exist. And then if you've got sort of legacy systems like a legacy access database, think outside the box in terms of functionality for how you can capture that data. A good example is the item functionality in Vault Professional. Items in Vault Pro, they're designed to be have bills of material and linked together, but they're just, in my mind, they're records that carry property data, can be linked together. And so if you've got any sort of relational type bit of information where you need to capture that and be able to search and see relationships and see information about records, you could potentially use items in Vault to capture that data, even if you have no need to manage bills of material, right? Records, independent of files, linked together for informational purposes. Items are a great use for that. Right, so now we've gotten through the daunting task of either getting our data into Vault or deciding how we're going to put it in over time, which is where most of our customers land. From there, it's time to get training done for the end users. And I kind of lump this all into discussion of training in general. I've already talked a little bit about administrator training and how important that is on the front end. In a larger implementation, there'll probably be multiple distinct sessions for training. For the administrators and power users, for the people that author CAD data like Inventor users or AutoCAD users, because there are going to be add-ins for their CAD tools that they'll need to know how to use. Vault can manage any file type, so if you've got people using the system, they don't ever make CAD files, but they do Word, Excel, PowerPoint, PDFs, etc. You may need to give them some training for how to use the system and how to get files in and out. Having them sit through the CAD client training is probably, irrelevant, so they wouldn't necessarily want to waste their time there. And then people that just need to get into the system and look at things, maybe get a copy and print, right? So in our larger implementations, we may have 4 distinct sessions and maybe multiple sessions within a category. So if you've got 20 people that author CAD data, 20 people in one training session is not the best way to learn. We need smaller class sizes than that. In addition, what we're finding is it's good, if possible, to have a more general training session. So here's the basic how-to, ideally maybe with some courseware and hands-on training. And then a follow-up session that discusses both the specific workflows that were developed in the configuration phase, but also, a refresher. So, maybe, the week before or a couple weeks before you go live, get them basic training, and then, either just before or right after the Vault becomes available for them, get them some training on, okay, here's how we take one of our drawings, put it in the system, release it, revise it, etc. Right, so just to review, we've been discussing what I consider the key elements for a successful Vault implementation. So next we're going to move on to a description of our process. And I do see another question came in. Do we have outlines for the different training levels, and also do you have a schedule of when this training might take place? I'm going to talk a little bit about our process here in a minute, and I'm going to show you one of our proposal documents that outlines the training sessions. So we normally in our proposals, it depends, we're changing our proposal process up a little bit. I know for every proposal that I generate, I do my best to capture what training is going to be required, who the intended, attendee should be, what courseware should be recommended. The scheduling typically takes place, during a project kickoff, because it needs to be flexible regarding how long it takes to get the server software installed, etc. Now, if we're talking about training in general here at Hagerman, I don't know that we generally put any, standard classroom training for Vault on our calendar. We usually do it by request, and we will, often as part of an implementation, schedule a standard training class for a customer for their users for them to send their users to. That's still something we're trying to, work out the best way to deliver, with an eye on, both quality of the training, but also making sure that it's cost effective for our customers. But if you're interested in just general Vault training, like, I want to know, show me how to use Vault Basic or show me how to use Vault Pro, absolutely, reach out to your Hagerman account manager and let them know that that's something you're interested in, and we can absolutely get something on a calendar. So let's move into a little bit of description of our process here at Hagerman. This is something, again, it's our idealized process. Specific implementations often end up a little bit different based on need. We're always very conscious of our customers' budgets and, what they have at their disposal, monetarily. And our goal is to help you as best we can reach, meet your goals while staying within your budget. Sometimes that means reducing the scope of the project, because what we absolutely don't want to do is leave our customers with a system that doesn't work, that doesn't meet, their stated need as we've, maybe pared it down, and ends up a waste of their investment, right? So we do our best at the outset, through our discovery, to determine, what software would be the best fit, what the scope of the process should be, and help with an ROI justification. And we do all of this as at no cost generally in what we consider our pre-sales process. And at that point, there's usually some tweaking of the scope of work. What I will typically do is say, based on what we've discussed and what your needs are, here's what we think you should implement. Here's how long we think it's going to take for us to help you do that. And then if that ultimately doesn't fit in the budget, it's like, okay, what is your budget? And what can we do? What elements, what can we pare down in this initial phase so that we can still help you get it implemented? And then maybe later on, once the solution is in place and demonstrating value, maybe then there'll be more appetite from the person signing the check to implement additional bits of functionality. So we do our best to be flexible if at all possible, right? But ideally, our initial discovery, our preliminary scope generation, it stays usually pretty high level. Depending on the specifics, we do a lot of these, so we can come up with a pretty decent task list to start with. But the end result is typically a quotation for software, for services. These quotes are generally conservative estimates based on our discovery and the scope that we've decided upon. And we've gotten pretty good at these estimates. The vast majority of our projects are on or under budget. We've done over 800 implementations in our 30 plus years of existence between, other PDM systems. Most of those at this point, I'm sure, are Vault. But I just want to give you a quick example, and if you've gone through this process with us before, you may have seen something like this. This is what a proposal document might look like, right? So we generally try to lay out the goals for the project, a scope of work, and then, multiple phase project with some estimates for the time required to execute, those phases, the installation, training for administrators, configuration, and then if there are special considerations like migrating data from a legacy system, we try to provide our best estimates for those as well. Those can be a little bit tricky to do in a purely pre-sales capacity, but we at least try to give a budgetary estimate. And then the proposal will commonly break down, on a task, on a phase-by-phase basis, what tasks we would execute. The goal here is to, if nothing else, assist you with an ROI determination, okay? Because a lot of times we're working with engineering managers or engineers, and they know they want and need Vault, but they have to go ask somebody to pay for it. We do our best to come up with something like this, so when, whoever's signing the check says, well, what are we getting for this? You can say, well, we're getting all of this stuff. Here's exactly what they're going to do, right? So this is something we try to deliver, including things like training curricula. So administrator training with the topics that would be required and recommended courseware, maybe end user training if there are multiple end user training sessions. We try to lay out as much of that as we can upfront, given what we can discover. If that all looks good and you decide to engage us for these services, from that point, we move on to project kickoff. Now we have started assigning dedicated project managers to all of our projects. We've been doing that for quite a while now. So there is a single point of contact if necessary for any questions or concerns about the implementation. They do what a project manager is meant to do, right? They monitor the project, they monitor the progress, facilitate communication, work on scheduling, and one of their most important tasks is to keep track of how many hours have been spent on the project and make sure that if we expect any overruns or scope creep, we identify those and discuss those and determine, do we really need to grow the scope? Why are we going to have an overrun? Do we need to reduce the scope as a result, et cetera, so that we're not, don't get to the end of the process and say, well, we're out of time and we haven't done this thing yet. That's the last thing we want to have happen, right? So our project manager is supposed to stay on top of the project and make sure any issues are brought to light to the group as early as possible. So all of our DM projects now involve a kickoff call. This call is intended to revisit the scope from the proposal, make sure things haven't changed. Sometimes it takes months to get something approved, for our customers to get something approved. So we want to make sure that in the interim, nothing has changed, from their need perspective. We discussed, infrastructure, is the server ready, the move, all the bits and pieces, the moving parts. And the result of that is an official signed project plan based largely off of, the initial scope. And you're probably seeing some parallels. This process follows what we envision as an ideal implementation. Move on to software installation to get something in place. Train the administrators so that they're well informed before they have to make configuration decisions, right? That way we end up with a solid system design that's going to meet your needs while being easy enough for your users to make use of. For larger implementations with more complex configurations, we do our best to document that design and make sure everyone agrees for how it's going to work. That way there are no surprises later on. Then we build out that configuration and test, iterate, test again. The data migration step, the way we handle data migration for the most part, what we find is most cost effective and beneficial to our customers is, especially if you're coming from Windows folders, we help you derive that procedure that you need to get the data cleaned up and into Vault. It's generally not cost effective for us to sit in front of the computer and try to clean up your data and put it in your Vault. It usually takes someone with the knowledge of your product, the knowledge of your existing file management system and how you've organized things. It's much more efficient for someone with knowledge of the system to clean up the data. So generally the way we handle data migration is we help you come up with a procedure and then you execute that procedure. If you want us to execute the procedure, we'll do it, but it's generally not cost effective to do so. Now, coming from an existing PDM system is a different story. In that case, you're probably, if you want to capture things like history from the existing PDM system, you're probably going to need to use a specialized tool to get that data loaded into Vault. We've got a lot of experience with that, so we would strongly recommend you engage us to do that, and that could itself be a separate project or like a sub-project because there's sometimes some custom programming of tools involved, etc. And so that may need closer investigation during discovery phase to see exactly what's going to take to get that data migrated. End user training follows. Standardized training can happen in parallel with some of the data migration stuff, the specific environment training. And then of course you flip the switch and people start using it. Now, for years and years when Vault first came out, it was just Vault Basic. Vault Basic is very basic. There's very little configuration. It kind of works the way it works. You check in, you check out, you search, copy design. There are very few things that it actually does. And so most of our implementations would be, we'll spend a couple days with you, we'll get the software installed, we'll get your people trained, and then you can generally figure out through a little bit of practice, over a week or two, you're probably pretty good at it. Once Vault Workgroup and Vault Professional came out and, the advanced functionality is there and all of this, workflow and custom configurations, what we found is, especially depending on the configuration, customers can tend to struggle a little bit in the first, few weeks or a month or two when they're trying to get, the system off the ground, especially if they have a lot of end users. And so what we've started doing in all of our proposals is building in time for adoption assistance, essentially dedicated sessions with the person who implemented your system so that they know have been in the conversations, they know your environment. You periodically get together with them for 2 or 4 hours at a time over a few weeks after go live just to answer questions, see how the system is going, provide recommendations, etc. And that is by far the best way to help you get the system adopted and in use by the end users. We also provide support for Vault, but that's not the best way to handle adoption assistance. Support is for software issues. The server's not working, my client is crashing, maybe some limited how-to questions in general. Questions on the configuration or any of the procedures are best left for something like a dedicated assistance session. And so that's why we started building in a bit of time for that activity, because it's crucial. Right, so that's our process from the day you reach out to us or we reach out to you and decide PDM would be a good fit for your company, all the way through your users have it in use and you're more productive as a result. So this system is sort of developed based on years of experience with our implementers, and we think it's a pretty good process. So we're almost done here. I do want to address just the importance of professional assistance, because it's not free. Somebody's got to justify the cost, right? And so the things that we provide, if you're talking about, or really any professional, when you're talking about PDM, if you decide not to go with us, please get some help from somebody, because the odds are very high your implementation is going to fail if you don't have someone with experience. Knowledge of best practices. I get that question more than anything from customers that I talk to in a pre-sales capacity where they have implemented themselves. It's like, yes, it's kind of working. We have some issues. We're not sure what the best practices are. And when I dig a little more into their system, I realize, yes, they are not doing things in the way maybe that Autodesk would recommend. So best practices knowledge is key. There's only so much of that you can dig up off of Google and YouTube. There's a much greater likelihood of adoption if you've got professional help, and the implementation itself is accelerated. Engineers are smart. A lot of engineers are also very good with software and processes. That said, it can take a long time to figure out how some of this stuff needs to work and the best way to put it to use. And so with enough effort, most people can usually get to a point where they can make use of Vault. That's different from using it in the most effective way and in a timely fashion. And of course, the peace of mind. I had a conversation with a customer yesterday who we were discussing implementing Vault Professional. He's like, well, yeah, we could probably do it ourselves, but I'd much rather have someone else to blame if something goes wrong, right? So there's always that too. It's like, well, I hired an expert. I can rely on that expert to do things, the right way. And one thing I really want to note, we're starting to run out of time here. One thing that I've found, and this comes from the money people, right? Most engineers, most people that use Inventor get it. Vault is an incredibly valuable tool. It will help you do your job better. It will solve business problems that you have. But then when a quote gets to someone higher up and they see, okay, 10 licenses of Vault Professional, and these are just 10 seats implementation. Why does it cost 3 times? You really have to decouple the cost of the software from the cost of the implementation. There's a very popular PLM system out there where the software is quote unquote free and all you have to do is implement it. Well, that's because the implementation is not trivial, right? And so the people that make that PLM software, they make a lot of money off of the services to get it in place, right? And especially with Autodesk and their new licensing regime, the cost of entry for PDM from a software standpoint has never been lower. But the software itself hasn't gotten any less capable, right? So that's always, someone asked that question of, well, the software is so inexpensive. There's no relationship between that. Especially with something like Vault Professional, there's no substitute for doing things right and spending the time to get it implemented correctly. So we're almost done here. I won't share too many of these horror stories. 2 of the big ones, and they weren't sure exactly. And so what they did was they took all of their Inventor files and they just drag and drop them into the Vault. You can drag and drop files into Vault. You should never do that with Inventor or AutoCAD files though. What that ended up with an Inventor files in their Vault linked to any of the parts. None of the assemblies was linked to any of the parts. Essentially the entire data set was unusable, right? And they had to start over. One of the most chilling ones, though, was we had a customer a couple years ago where they self-implemented. They didn't realize the importance to get their vault backed up, and the server died, and they lost 2 years of engineering data that was in vault because they didn't have a backup. So all of those things are all things that we address as part of our implementations. So there's no substitute, for professional assistance. All right, and with that, we'll open it up for questions. I do see one other question came